My name is Russ Feingold, and I am president of the American Constitution Society, the country's foremost progressive legal organization, with more than 200 student and lawyer chapters across the nation. ACS is celebrating its 20th year of shaping legal debate, nurturing the next generation of lawyers, judges, and advocates, and ensuring that the law is a force to improve the lives of all people. We are especially focusing our work in this 20th anniversary year on our Constitution's founding failures when it comes to race and equality in this country, and reckoning with our past to create a more just future. If you don't already, we encourage you to follow ACS on social media, including on Twitter at ACS Law. You can also find us online at acslaw.org. There you can join ACS and find more information about upcoming events and opportunities. Communities of color are currently on the front lines of twin urgent public health challenges: COVID-19 and climate change. Not only have Americans of color been more likely to contract and die of COVID-19, but they've also been less likely to have access to COVID vaccines and more likely to have underlying health conditions caused by unsanitary water and exposure to high levels of pollution. For today's discussion, Founding Failures, reckoning with our Constitution's generational impacts on health and well-being, we want to take a step back to reflect on why race is too often a determinant of health and well-being in this country, and ask what law and policy tools are available to address the disproportionate harm borne by communities of color. So we are so pleased to have a great panel of experts who have agreed to join us today for this important conversation. First, we have Christophe Courchain, the Assistant Attorney General at the Massachusetts Office of the Attorney General. Next, we have Chandra Taylor, Senior Attorney and leader of the Southern Environmental Law Center's Environmental Justice Initiative. And they are joined by Professor Yearby, the Professor of Law and Executive Director and co-founder of the Institute for Healing, Justice, and Equity at the St. Louis University School of Law. To get this conversation started and to moderate it, I'm going to turn it over to our Executive Vice President and someone I'm proud to call a colleague, who is really the driving force behind our organization's proud portrayal this year for our 20th anniversary of the fundamental problems of the origin of the Constitution and its legacy with regard to race. So thank you, Zanelle, and I will turn it over to Zanelle October.
Thank you so much, Russ. Thank you to my colleague, Deborah Perlin, for organizing today's panel, and to Chandra, Professor Yearby, and Christophe for sharing their knowledge with us today. I'm so excited to jump in to get this conversation started. Let's just set the frame for everyone on both environmental justice and on health here. So I would first ask so we could give the listeners some context. Chandra, would you kick us off on environmental justice? What is it? What does it look like in the work that you do? Just so we all have a good idea.
Yes, thank you so much. So I'll start with talking about environmental justice in the most general sense, which is the environmental movement's response to environmental racism. So that's a very general definition of what environmental justice is. Then there's the EPA definition, the Environmental Protection Agency definition of environmental justice, which is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of people of color and low-income people in environmental decision-making. Now, in my practice at Southern Environmental Law Center, what we are doing to achieve environmental justice is basically making sure that communities of color and low-income communities are not continuing to suffer a disproportionate burden of environmental harm. So whenever there is an environmental harm, we're also looking at the same time to see, are the people who are suffering from this environmental harm also people of color or also low-income people? Because we know that these communities, my community is the community that is likely to suffer even more from the burden of pollution, of being sited near polluting facilities, of having fewer environmental amenities like parks, of having lesser opportunity of being connected to basic amenities that are associated with living in cities, like having extension of sewer lines or having extensions of water lines. That often happens where communities are in the extraterritorial jurisdiction of a municipality, and for quite some time have been denied the opportunity to connect to some of those services. So looking at it in terms of, we know that the reasons for environmental injustices include historic legal discrimination, market forces, zoning forces, and really all the time, a perceived lack of political power. So whenever we see, someone comes to us with an issue where they're attempting to prevent an environmental harm or to reverse one, like, so preventing a polluting facility or perhaps cleaning up a contaminated site, we're also looking at the question of what is the perceived political power of this community, because often there are intentional efforts to disenfranchise people of color, and then there are the remnants of historic legal discrimination that result in a perception of lack of political power for communities of color. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Chandra. Professor Yearby, can we turn to you next to set us up with the framework on racial health disparities? They're very stark, as we've seen front and center with COVID right now. Can you talk about what you see going on generally and the legal framework that you can set up for us for this discussion?
Yes, thank you for including me. And so how I frame it is to speak about them in terms of racism, health disparities. We have been researching about the disproportionate impact of racism on the poor health outcomes of not just racial and ethnic minorities, but all people who live within the United States. And so the time has come for us to really connect the fact that this is really a result of inequality. And as Chandra mentioned, we look at it in terms of the law, the ways that the law has perpetuated and limited people's access to equal opportunity and to resources, particularly in the environmental space. For me, I focus on the laws that were passed during the New Deal era, which included the Jim Crow era, which limited racial and ethnic minorities, women, and other groups' ability to receive equal employment protections and opportunities. So when we look at the Fair Labor Standards Act that sets a minimum wage, a 40-hour week requirement, that law doesn't apply to a lot of workers, particularly low wage workers and those who have been deemed essential during the COVID-19 pandemic. And so we have left them without protections of minimum wage, fair pay, paid sick leave, often workers' comp. And so that looks like the people who are picking our food, processing our food, serving our food, who we buy our food from, the people who clean the hospitals, the people who provide meals to people in hospitals and nursing homes. And so when we think about racism, health disparities, I just want to be clear that that impacts all of us. When we look at the health outcomes of whites, Asians, Latinos, Blacks, and other groups within the United States, that they are poor because our laws have set up unequal access to things like employment. I think I will stop there, but I just want to highlight that one last thing, that it also is tied to what Chandra said, is unequal power, and that law has been used to subsidize other groups' access to resources. And so often people talk about the fact that we don't want to give something to essential workers that they have not earned. But when we look at our laws and the fact that during the Jim Crow era, many low-wage workers were not receiving the same benefits as other workers, either wealthy workers or white workers that were supported by unions, that lots of groups have been subsidizing this country for quite a while, including essential workers during COVID-19, and they are not receiving the same benefits, which results in their poorer health outcomes.
Thank you. Lots for us to unpack in our conversation today, but I'm going to go to Christoph first at this moment so he can chat a little bit with us about his take on the legal framework, the work that he's been doing around environmental racism. And yeah, we'd love to hear from you from there. And Christoph, before you begin, just a reminder to everyone who's listening, please do chat, include any questions you have for our panelists in the Q&A. I'll be monitoring that, and we'll have some time to address those in the programming. Go ahead, Christoph, sorry.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to participate in this conversation. It's an important one for my office. My boss is Maura Healey, the Attorney General of Massachusetts, and she has made racial justice her #1 priority over the last year especially, but she has been focused on this issue for a long time. And in my capacity, I'm the deputy chief now of the Energy and Environment Bureau, where we try to bring the energy advocacy that our office does around ratepayers together with our environmental protection work, which is a long history and is really where I spent 6 years before taking this deputy chief job. I was the chief of the Environmental Protection Division. And we, essentially environmental justice is, I've always viewed that as our job. It's a lot of people's jobs, but it's definitely the job of the Attorney General of a state with responsibility for law enforcement, and specifically environmental law enforcement, where we just have a fundamental obligation, and it's driven by a lot of sources, including the federal constitution from our perspective, but also especially our state constitution, which contains in Article 97 of the amendments to that constitution a very clear statement that all people shall have a right to clean air and clean water, freedom from excessive and unnecessary noise, and the qualities of the environment. It is a human right. It's a constitutionally protected right, and that's how I have thought about it in the first instance. What we do have, as has been pointed out quite eloquently, we have a legacy of environmental injustice in Massachusetts and across the country. Lots and lots and lots of decisions have been made, either intentionally or recklessly, you might say, in a way that disproportionately affects communities of color and other vulnerable communities. And it's really our job to put that issue at the center of our work. And so I think about how we can use this concept of environmental justice in exercising all the discretion that our office has. And that includes which enforcement cases we take. We civilly enforce against polluters. We, as an independent constitutional officer, get to decide how to pursue the legal defense of the Commonwealth when the Commonwealth is sued. We also have the opportunity in many cases to do creative settlements in communities that are relatively better off, and think about the needs of neighboring communities that are in need of environmental benefit. And so we have the opportunity to do settlements that support this goal of environmental justice. And I'll just say that over the last 4 years, environmental justice was at the center of what we were trying to do in pushing it back in more than 200 legal actions against the Trump administration's policies, which often were often shortchanged environmental justice and were quite damaging to public health. So I may leave it there, other than to say that we're really focused in our office as a whole as thinking about these issues as integrated with others. As the professor mentioned, we have been thinking about this issue of racial disparities in health, and together with our healthcare division, which plays a significant role in the public health infrastructure of the state, how can we address these social determinants of health more systematically? And so we did do a report at the end of last year about that issue, and a comprehensive report on racial injustice in the health system. So that is another opportunity that an attorney general has to raise those types of issues up into the public discussion, put them in front of policymakers, and identify solutions. So I think I will stop there at the moment.
Okay, thank you to all of you for setting up our discussion then. Chandra, I'll go back to you first to kind of dig into some of your work a little more specifically, especially since the Flint water crisis really sharpened our focus around environmental justice. How have you seen a difference since then in approaching the work and getting people to be more interested in the work, and really honing in on these issues as an issue of its own?
I really have seen the biggest difference in people's willingness to actually engage with, the fact that people of color are more likely to be burdened by environmental harm since summer of 2020, since George Floyd's murder. That really, I think, has been a huge watershed moment for the attention of the American people on racism writ large. And then I think that also has made people more willing to actually speak the words environmental racism, to acknowledge that, there's systemic and institutional racism that leads us to this place where we know that people of color are more likely to experience the burden of environmental harm. Toxic Race and Waste, the report of the United Church of Christ, that was published in 1987. So even then, it was established that even like middle income people of color were still more likely to be sited near hazardous waste facilities, that those communities were more likely to have hazardous waste facilities sited near them than lower wealth white communities. So that doesn't take away from the fact that definitely lower wealth communities are still facing environmental harm, but people of color are experiencing more. And the underpinning of racism and the unintentional acts that continue to pervade our system, that they exist, and we're still dealing with unraveling that today. So, Flint water crisis, what happened in Flint, is heartbreaking. And I think, unfortunately, if with time and resources and attention of attorneys, I always say there are never enough attorneys to unravel all of the illegalities that exist in our society, but that if we just continue to look, that we would find more instances, so many communities that, have lead service lines. Now, that was a particularly bad situation because of, the change in the water source for that community, but there are definitely, all over the nation, we could see there are, unfortunately, injustices like this happening, and that people who are already overburdened and less resources are, suffering because of that. So I would say that, 2020 really made it, I find that in listening to other regulators, our state regulators, conservation partners, just the general population being more willing to just say, yes, this is racism. And then, is getting to the next step of, what is it that's going to happen to actually effectively change the course of things. And I think, you know, I could get into some of the things that I think are hopeful in the recent federal administration, that I think are big picture items that could be really, really meaningful toward the goal of achieving environmental justice. But I'll stop right there in case you had, you know, a follow-up or wanted to ask the other panelists more.
Yeah, I definitely want to follow up and pull in the other panelists, because what you said is so right about the events of 2020. I mean, the CDC, as you know, recently declared racism a serious public health threat. That's different for us to see. And I'm wondering, after all of the events, after a declaration like that, more heightened awareness of environmental racism, calling it out by name, I want to pick up the question that you sort of asked, which is, does that have any concrete legal or policy implications or effects? What's next? It's great to hear the words, but what's next for us? Whether you want to take that or any of the panelists.
So I'll pause and let the other panelists respond first.
I'll jump in because actually my institute, the Institute for Healing, Justice, and Equity at St. Louis University, published a report about declarations of racism as a public health crisis. And we included some key points that we saw that were missing from the declarations, and that was co-authored by Dr. Keon Gilbert, Dr. Akira Banks, myself, and Crystal Lewis. And one of the key points that I want to highlight, one, that not a lot of the declarations included a definition of racism, which is so important because even as we have been talking today about racism, we have talked about intentional, unintentional, but really when we think about the US, it is a system of racism, right? That has been so ingrained and intertwined with some of our policies. So even when we try to work towards addressing racism, we're not able to because of how our institutions and our systems function. I think the second one that we wanted to highlight and that we are going back through and seeing even more is that many of the declarations didn't include specific policy goals. And so they might have mentioned in a couple of places, I know Massachusetts talked about taking some of the funding from policing to put it towards housing, but it was Boston was one of the few places that talked about specific policy goals, right? Not ensuring that all workers had paid sick leave. And so I think it's really time for us, if we're going to declare racism as a public health crisis, that we put in specific things that we're going to address in terms of policy. Are we going to do inclusionary zoning? What are the things we're going to do around education? And then finally, to me, what is also missing is the need for us to conduct truth and reconciliation. We cannot get past racism. We cannot address these issues about racism, health disparities, and environmental health and racism without listening to people who have suffered from it, supporting them, because you cannot harm people from generations upon generations without hearing their pain, their harm, and supporting us moving forward in a healing way. And so those are the things that I think are missing from this discussion about racism and even racism as a public health crisis.
Thank you, Professor Yearby. I want to kind of piggyback on something you said there. You've given us a lot to kind of unpack. And I kind of want to underscore and pull out a little bit. We heard in the media last week, of course, that America is not racist, from Senator Scott, VP Harris, some others. And, you know, we've been focusing as an organization, ACS, on race in the Constitution and the important part that it's played and continues to play. These policies and laws haven't come out of thin air. They've been sustained and really created and enforced by our government over time. And I like what you said. I think it's true that we really have to face the truth about it. And you mentioned kind of unpacking that a little and the systems and structures being so intertwined. Could you elaborate on that a little bit for our audience?
Yes, so I think that too many people tend to focus on just the history of slavery as if after slavery it all went away. I like to pull people to think about more recently. I'm going to give you two sort of examples of during COVID and during the New Deal / Jim Crow era. What's amazing to me is often scholars or people talk about the New Deal era where we supported people being able to buy homes, the creation of the middle class, and not also recognizing that that at the same time is connected to the Jim Crow era, where we did not allow people of color, women, other groups to benefit from that. And so they were either explicitly left out at the federal level, at the state level, or implicitly allowed to not be contained in those measures, right? So I mentioned the minimum wage laws. When we think about how people were part of unions that got paid sick leave, people of color, women were left out. And so when we try to say that the US is not a racist country, I think for me, what we have to understand is that inequality is so intertwined with our political process of not giving people equal power and not giving people equal protection. I think to me, it is crystal clear in terms of the COVID pandemic that initially when we thought that it was just hitting certain groups of people who we valued, then we put a lot of money towards it and we talked about how are we going to protect them. But as soon as it became linked with immigrants, people of color, low wage workers, that it became then they are to blame. And so when we look at people in government, the former head of HHS, the former Surgeon General, many governors blaming people of color for their culture and for drinking or doing other things. And that's why they had increased rates of COVID-19. To me, that speaks to the continuation of racism and inequality, because those who are supposed to be protecting us are having a different view of who they should protect. And the last thing I would say, that it becomes even clearer when we look at our vaccination rates, not just in places where Florida, where it's talked about that the governor has shifted doses to particular communities. He should not have that power to do so. But when we look at stories that look at the entire US and look at who has actually had access to vaccines, I don't think that anybody would say that it was particularly one person. But what they do say, and a lot of pushback has been said, is that we cannot, because of our Constitution, give out vaccine doses to racial groups who have been most impacted, because that is against our Constitution. To me, that says to us all that we have a problem with race, where you cannot use race to actually get vaccine doses to the people most impacted, then there is something wrong with race in the US.
Thank you, Professor Yearby. Shifting gears just a little to go back to a previous point that was made, we talked about the CDC's recent declaration of racism as a serious public health threat. On the state level, for Christoph, Chandra, is there a state level equivalent to making this kind of determination? If so, what sort of legal or policy effects could a state level declaration have that's similar? Any thoughts there?
I think I will say that I'm not totally sure under Massachusetts law, for example, how we would go about making that particular declaration out of the Department of Public Health, and I am a little bit unclear on how that would work. But that being said, one of the things that has recently happened, especially in the wake of last year's racial reckoning that we've all gone through, is that Massachusetts did pass a very ambitious climate change action bill earlier this year, and the governor did sign it. And it's called the Next Generation Roadmap Act, I believe. But a significant part of that bill, and I don't think this would have happened before last year, was an environmental justice set of provisions, which really made it clear as a matter of statute for the first time in Massachusetts that environmental injustice was a serious public health issue, that in fact, one of the concepts that I think really speaks to some of the themes we've heard about today is that it is a real thing to talk about cumulative impact of environmental harm. And for decades, those of us who have tried to litigate under the National Environmental Policy Act have tried to get the federal government and the state government analogs to recognize cumulative impact as a valid basis for decision making, such that a particular facility or project may not be by itself a singular source of harm in a way that would preclude it being cited or preclude a permit being granted. But in conjunction with the cumulative impact of prior many racist decisions that were taken going back decades, that community is overburdened with environmental harms and public health harms. And I found it significant that the legislature, the Republican governor, and the environmental justice community in the state came together around recognizing this issue of cumulative impact in law for the first time, which gives the lawyers involved on who want to advocate on these issues, whether they be in the state government like myself, or at the state agencies, or in the environmental justice or conservation or public health communities, the tools that they may need to get judicial recognition of some of these concepts. And maybe the right decision gets made the first time by the decision makers to not cite that facility in that neighborhood, or to impose additional controls on facilities in those neighborhoods that are currently operating and need renewed permits, for example. So I think this concept of cumulative impact being recognized in Massachusetts under Massachusetts law, and in other states that have been recently thinking about passing environmental justice and public health disparity laws, can make a real difference. And that is certainly a hope of ours going forward.
Thank you. Chandra, any hopes of yours going forward? Kind of coming from Christoph's comments there.
Absolutely. So there are, in the state of North Carolina, with our Governor Cooper's his upon re-election, he issued an executive order, basically really being intentional about pushing funding toward the elimination of racial health disparities and acknowledgement of environmental injustices as part of the cause for racial health disparities. So to the extent that, governors use that authority to, really say, here's where we're looking to push funding towards. So more actual efforts to eliminate racial health disparities. That's huge. I appreciated it as a resident of the state of North Carolina to see that made plain, and also to see it made plain with a connection to environmental injustices, noting that that COVID-19 as a pandemic, how much more it's harming communities that are already overburdened and enhancing racial health disparities. So we know that we've seen more deaths in communities of color from COVID-19, as we look at the percentage of population. Looking at on the federal level, I am excited to see the Grijalva-McEachin bill that sets out a path to court for violations of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is very important in the environmental space. Each federal agency has its own Office of Civil Rights. It is prohibited for a federal aid recipient to discriminate in the use of the federal aid. And as an environmental practitioner, we've been raising this issue of permitting that has a disparate and discriminatory impact on communities of color, but the EPA has not made the decision to take away the federal aid that is going to state permitting agencies that make these decisions that have this disparate discriminatory impact. And, you know, as I said, I'm not a part of the federal agency, so I can't say why that federal agency hasn't made that decision when other federal agencies like education and transit have made the decision to take away federal aid, when the federal aid recipients have made decisions, permitting decisions that are discriminatory. But now there's a piece of federal legislation that's pending that would make it so that we don't have to ask the federal agency, hey, will you take away funding? Because we know that, you know, the federal aid recipient, which is the state permitting agency, that they're making a permitting decision that has a discriminatory impact, that we could actually possibly go straight to court and have really more of an opportunity to lay out the evidence of discriminatory impact. So that's something that's on the horizon that I think, you know, I have no, you know, I can't read the tea leaves on what will happen with that, but to actually see it as a possibility, I think is it should be there. And, you know, as a practitioner, as, you know, representing communities of color, that tool would be, I think, very significant in actually getting toward environmental justice and looking for more state level opportunities. So more state legislation that actually says, so right now in the state of North Carolina, in our solid waste statute, that's the one environmental permitting statute that says, you know, a solid waste facility shall not be cited if the cumulative impacts of this facility and, you know, other facilities nearby basically will have a discriminatory adverse impact on communities protected by Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Like that facility shall not be cited if there will be this discriminatory adverse impact on communities of color. Looking for other permitting, like seeing that type of legislation and that applies to other environmental permitting agencies, I think that would be significant. And it's a tool, you know, like sometimes many times when I'm interacting with state permitting agencies and looking at the way that the statutes are written, there are not as many clear avenues to where I can see like this agency is required to deny this permit if they see that the cumulative impact of this decision is going to hurt an overburdened community. So seeing more of that in statute is absolutely what we need in order to, reverse so much of what has already happened and to prevent more environmental harm.
Great, thank you. I'm going to move into audience questions in just a bit, but before I do, Professor Yearby, you've written about and you started talking about, and I had the opportunity to read in preparation for this panel, some of your literature about how racial minorities built this country, continue to sustain it today, often without equal pay or employment protections. To help address this, you've spoken about needing a health justice framework. And you talk about truth and reconciliation, which we're looking at and talking about here too at ACS. Can you give us a brief, I know it's a large subject, of how you view that and how do you see that playing out?
Yes, so thank you. My co-authors, Professor Seema Mohapatra, who will be at St. John's University, Emily Benfer, who is at Wake Forest, and Lindsay Wiley, who is at American University, have written together about health justice. And this is a framework in part based on the environmental justice movements, the civil rights movements, really key to is centering community and empowering community in change. And so the health justice framework, we write about the ways that policymakers, governments could use it. It has 3 key points. 1, structural remediation. 2, providing financial and other supports. And then 3, community empowerment and engagement. And the structural remediation really goes to what has been discussed, that we begin to think about the laws, the structures, the systems in place that have kept people from equal access to a good environment, to equal access to good health care, education, and employment, and a focus on those. One of the ways you can do it is by using racial equity impact assessments to really begin to think about how laws have overburdened or disproportionately burdened groups. And then we think about the second point is about support, right? Financial, material support, that it takes generations to get to the harm suffered from racism and inequality. And so we need to think about how can we provide support to people to be able to do it. I will use the COVID-19 pandemic as an example. If we want workers to stay home who are low wage, then we have to provide them with paid sick leave, hazard pay, and other things so that they can afford to stay home. And then finally, last but not least, community empowerment and engagement, that it is so key for communities to be a part of the change. We often come up with policies and then perhaps go to community later instead of starting with community first. And we have seen how this has been somewhat helpful during the COVID-19 vaccine outreach, that the government worked with Native American tribes and they were able to get the vaccine out to their community members such that they actually had extra and gave it to other groups. So starting with community, empowering them because they know what they need, they know what they have been suffering from. And then if you wouldn't mind, I just wanted to talk a little bit about Title VI. I love the discussion about Title VI in the environmental space. It is also used in the health space and hasn't been very effective. You rarely hear about providers who have turned away racial and ethnic minorities or hospitals that have closed being held accountable for the disproportionate impact it has on racial and ethnic minorities in rural communities or other communities. And so what I would hope is that as we're strengthening Title VI for environmental health, that we also do so in terms of healthcare access, that we hold hospitals accountable for the tax benefits that they receive. There was a recent article that talked about some not-for-profits don't actually provide enough care to the people that they should be serving. And throughout COVID-19, we've seen lots of cases and articles about how minorities have been turned away, including some Latinos in Indiana and North Carolina who actually needed healthcare, who were turned away from getting the care that they needed. So my hope is that we strengthen Title VI as well in the healthcare frame to ensure that people who are getting paid by the government, receiving those benefits, contracting with the government, have to provide the same level of care to racial and ethnic minorities and women. Because under the ACA, that was the first time in the history that we actually prohibited discrimination against based on gender. So based on gender identity as well. So.
Thank you so much for that, Professor Yearby. Okay, I am going to go to the audience questions now. And the first one that I'll take, I'm actually going to expand a little bit. The audience member is curious about proactive legal government work that government can do around health equity as separate from policymaking. And I want to expand that a bit for whoever wants to take that one. Christoph, maybe that's you or any Professor Yearby or Chandra. I want to expand that a bit too. You all are doing amazing, really cool work. And we have a lot of law students and lawyers on the call who might be interested in this line of work. So can you talk a bit about how they might get into this space? I think they'd be curious about that, but also what legal work could government do around this issue? Any of you can take it first.
Happy to take a little crack at it. I'd say that this there is a tremendous opportunity to think strategically in a lot of different areas of law, and I think that I'm often fond of my federal environmental laws that are I think have been well used by environmental groups, especially in defense of privileged areas more commonly. And I think these laws have tremendous power and access to federal court. And we in our office, for example, have a enforcement program that we are doing as our office with some support from the state agencies, but not much. We're doing it as an independent enforcement project to enforce the Federal Clean Water Act and Clean Air Act. And we have made that project focus in on environmental justice communities as a priority. So that is an opportunity that every lawyer, every law student that's going out into the universe of possible environmental or public health areas to focus in on those priority type cases, and even just say that's what you want to do as a law student or prospective employee, and say that's the focus that I'd like to bring to this. And I think with the right employer who's interested in that topic, I think that's going to be a very well received focus. And there are underserved communities in every state, in every service area of a nonprofit, of every federal agency's jurisdiction. There are underserved areas, and if you as a younger lawyer or law student say, I have a great idea about how to attack that, or I would like to hear more from the community about how to attack that problem that I have heard about or that I may have experienced, I think that is the level of curiosity and interest that certainly in my office is extremely, we want to empower our younger staff to take on these issues. And I'll just give one little example where we have a brand new lawyer in our office, who's recently promoted to assistant attorney general, who came in and started working on this federal enforcement caseload that we have, and taken on a variety of cases. But with some surplus money from these cases, we managed to kickstart a air monitoring project in Springfield, Massachusetts, which is the asthma capital of the country for childhood asthma, just an epidemic proportion problem. And we're placing 80 air monitors throughout the community, an area which was basically an air monitor desert for all intents and purposes, to understand the air quality in terms of toxic pollutants and in terms of more conventional pollutants in a way that will allow us to target enforcement cases. And also the community's deciding where these monitors are going, and they're going to have access to this data on an ongoing basis in real time. The technology is really cheap and powerful at this point. And so that was something that she came up with in conjunction with talking with some of the stakeholders in the community about that was a need. And she pursued that, proposed it, and we rolled it out on Earth Day with the Attorney General at an event in Springfield. So that's the type of opportunity you have as a younger lawyer, I think, to innovate in the space. And I'm just intensely proud of that work that one of those younger lawyers in my office did. So I'll stop there. But that is something that you can do in a public law office with the right support.
Excellent. Thank you, Christoph. Chandra or Professor Yerby, would either of you like to comment on that question, or I'm happy to move on if not? Okay.
I'll jump in and just say one of the things that I think is important is just to highlight the need for health equity. And so Daniel Dawes, who's the executive director of Satcher Health Leadership Institute, has been working along with our former Surgeon General, David Satcher, on really trying to integrate health equity into how we collect our data. And then thinking about how we also then pass laws and policies to address it. At the Institute and with my law students, we have been working on projects to try to connect laws to health outcomes, and that's called legal epidemiology. We have been working with the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and there are other groups out there, Change Lab Solutions, and there's a group at Temple. But I think for me, we don't even think about the ways that laws impact health. And so if you are interested in health equity, that could be a way that you begin to support health equity and policy to address these issues, is to actually track laws and see how it can have an impact on health. See if we are passing laws that prevent pregnancy discrimination. Is that going to lead to a decrease in infant mortality, maternal mortality? And so those are things that I think students could think about doing.
Thank you. I'll move on to the next question and broaden this one a little bit too. How does international law, or how could it help move along environmental justice, health equity in your line of work? Have you seen it used? If so, how? It's okay if no response to that.
I would just maybe say one thing, which is that I do view, and I think our office has put on a conference on this last year in conjunction with some of the centers at NYU, that climate change is a public health emergency, and we are entering a phase of quite a bit of international discussion around climate change, environmental justice, and they're often now linked together in a really, I'm very encouraged by that, because it was historically a climate change discussion and an environmental justice discussion, and then there was maybe a third public health discussion, and they didn't really have a lot of overlap or a lot of synergies. And I do feel that the international discussion around climate change that we're hearing a lot about with the national determined contribution that was announced from the Biden administration on Earth Week, I think we have an opportunity to bring some of the environmental principles and climate commitments that are part of international discussions, and make sure that environmental justice is at the center of those commitments, because that's going to be really important. That's where I think international law, and specifically the international laws that the many manifold, very complicated issues of international climate law could bring some of these concepts in, because there is an equity concern at the neighborhood level, there's an equity concern at the state and regional level, there's an equity concern nationally, but there's very strong, important social justice issues associated with the United States on the international stage, with really many of the countries and neighborhoods. Everything from countries to neighborhoods are going to be very adversely affected by the climate emergency, and are already experiencing that right now. And I think if we bring that focus, that's an opportunity for us to make sure we're not missing major pieces of the puzzle as we go about this international discussion.
And I'll add on international policy, perhaps more so than law, as we look at the specific issue of the use of biomass for energy. Part of our work at Southern Environmental Law Center is about going, we we're doing the work of going to the UK to say, you're making a decision to use biomass that is sourced in the southeastern United States, and here are the actual implications of your choice here, and we're asking you to make a different choice. So, I mean, the same way that the United States has made a decision to rejoin, the climate agreement, that we can also, as informed advocates, request of other nations that are making decisions that actually harm communities here in the States, like to make them more aware of the implications of their decisions. So that that's advocacy that our offices are involved in right now, in negotiations with the UK about their decisions on biomass. And in fact, that is also an environmental injustice issue, where the fuel is being sourced and where it's actually being processed. Right now, we're seeing that in a predominantly Native American community in southeastern North Carolina. We're seeing the impacts of biomass processing facilities, and advocating against that in our state administrative court. But not using the international laws themselves in the forum, but there is an international link there that I think it was important to highlight for whoever had that question and the rest of the audience.
Thank you. So we have about 4 minutes remaining. I'll ask this one last question, which might be for you, Chandra. And as she's answering that, if Christoph and Professor Yerby could think about in 1 minute, what do you want to leave the audience with as your final thoughts here? That would be great. So Chandra, for you, are you seeing more support for economic reparations and rematriation of land as these environmental justice tables are becoming more diverse? Is that something you're familiar with?
I've only just started to hear about that. And, quite frankly, I don't know what the responses are. We have a really preeminent reparations scholar in North Carolina, Sandy Darity, who has like all sorts of background on that topic. And I hope that people who are listening look into what he is doing in his scholarship. But I'm glad you asked the question, because it's been coming up, but I haven't seen a robust response with a really, solid, outline of how that actually would look. But I think it's an important question, and I'm glad that it was asked again, despite the fact that I don't know, a real solid answer on it.
Looks like Professor Yerby might. Yeah. Thank you.
Not that I know the answer. I just want to highlight that as part, and this is the good part about the declarations of racism as a public health crisis, that some communities are putting in reparations, right? So Asheville, North Carolina, and the county that includes that have talked about reparations. California is talking about reparations. Evanston in Illinois is talking about reparations, not connected, unfortunately, to environmental justice, but really in terms of talking about trying to redress the harms of inequality, right, that have been decades, centuries old. And so I am excited about that discussion about reparations. I just think that we need to expand it to include some of these issues we talked today, including environmental justice.
Thank you. And with our 2 minutes remaining, 30-second responses on your last thoughts that you'd like to share with our audience today. Christoph, can we start with you?
Sure. No, it was a real pleasure and a privilege to be part of this discussion, even if it was a bit on short notice, but I was gratified to be able to contribute, and I learned a lot from my co-panelists. And I would just say that this issue of truth is really important, and looking at what is true in the eye. And we do have to see the implications of the legacy of real racism in communities across the country. And we need to approach that in all aspects of our work. And so that includes our climate work, that includes our more traditional environmental work, that includes things that are typically in silos with the energy world as well. It's really important to think outside of those silos and think about how we can tackle that job of promoting justice.
Thank you. Professor Yerby, any final thoughts?
I would just say that for me, it's really recognizing that racism harms us all and that we need to work together to move past it. That it's not just about the law and policy, that it is about truth and reconciliation, but it's also about repairing the trauma from it and moving forward to work together for a better society. Because otherwise, as we have seen through COVID, through environmental harms, that we all are going to be harmed as a result.
Thank you. And Chandra, last word.
I hope that those who are attending and all of us on the call also take some consideration of opportunities to make law school a possibility for more students of color. So the Marshall Motley program of LDF, I think, is a great example. In order to see justice, all the way, down into communities, I think it also helps that there are advocates of color who can afford to do this work, who are able to get into these spaces. So making sure that a legal education is affordable and something that people of color can actually do is important. And I hope that people will think about that in their own philanthropy, in their own efforts as we look at who the next generation of civil rights attorneys are going to be.
Thank you so much. Chandra, Christoph, Professor Yerby, on behalf of ACS, thank you all for sharing your wisdom and time with us today. Huge thank you.
My pleasure. It's nice to meet everybody.
So much.